So hello, I'll try that again. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you in attendance, whether you're a seasoned participant or student or here for the very first time. I am very excited to launch into our first Frank Davis Memorial Lecture of the year. And this series has actually been going on since 1989, so it's a court-hold institution of its own. And it's to be delivered by our esteemed colleague from SOAS, Dr. Maria Cristina Martinez Juan. But before I hand over to our Dean of Research, Lucy Bradnock, to introduce her properly, I want to take a moment to introduce the series and share also a glimpse of what's to follow in the next month. By the way, I am Meredith Winter. I am a lecturer of early Islamic arts here at the Courtauld. I realized as I was planning this introduction that I don't know how to say the title of the series out loud. How does one pronounce X in art history, computer vision? Now, I probably should have thought of this when I proposed the title, but I didn't. And so I found myself doing something I do all too often, which is I Googled it. Now, the results I got, which is to say the response supplied by the AI generative summary at the top of the page, told me that I had a choice. I could just not pronounce the X. I could say and, or with, or I could say in collaboration with. And at that point, I felt a bit like our banner image of Paul Spooner's 1983 work, 5 Artists Reflect on Their Waning Powers. Because when my co-organizer and I, that is to say Professor Stephen Whiteman, who unfortunately could not be here tonight, and I were planning this series, we are interested in the ways scholarship and technologies collaborate, yes, but also diverge. We are interested in how we might mold digital technologies to our needs and to our limitations, and how digital technologies mold us to theirs. We wanted to hear from scholars on how the digital in all its varied forms has shaped our collective understanding of what the past is and what the past does. So given that context, I felt very hemmed in by what technology told me X means. Instead, I would like to propose the X as both a point of intersection and divergence. The X marks a crossroads where we as thinkers and people inhabiting an increasingly digital space need to engage with and distinguish ourselves and our ideas from the technologies we use. So tonight we will hear from one vision of art history in collaboration with computer vision to help us think through how we think through the past. On December 2nd, we will hear from Benjamin Zweig from the Pratt Institute on computer processing and its links to art historical method. On December 9th, we will have Lamia Balafrige of UCLA talking about the medieval antecedents that inflect our sense of how machines work. And on December 16th, Anna Naslund of Stockholm University will explore how digital infrastructures and platforms structure scholarly thinking about images and those implications. So I hope we will see you all again in the next weeks. But now I will turn to Lucy Bradnock to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Martinez Juan.
Hello, good evening, and welcome. Thanks so much, Meredith. And huge thanks to Meredith and to Stephen Whiteman for organising this series, which brings together so many very vital and urgent questions for our discipline, but also for our society. My name is Lucy Bradnock. I am Dean for Research here at the Courtauld, and it's my great pleasure tonight to welcome Dr. Cristina Juan to speak with us. Dr. Juan is a researcher, teacher, curator based at SOAS, where she's a member of the Center of Southeast Asian Studies, and where in 2017 she spearheaded the creation of Philippine Studies. She's a scholar whose research sits at the intersection, the crossroads, I really wanted it to be a kiss, of two really major current imperatives in our discipline and in the world of art and culture and their histories and their institutions. The first, decoloniality, cultural patrimony and repatriation. Frameworks and actions that seek to address the cultural violence of colonialism and the historic asymmetries of our discipline. The second, of course, the challenges and opportunities posed by digital methods, platforms, and systems. With training in the digital humanities from the University of Leiden and the interactive telecommunications program at NYU, Dr. Juan has implemented a number of really important digital projects that seek not only to provide open access to colonial archives, but also to create avenues for sourcing and inscribing annotative knowledge from academic and cultural originators in the Philippines and Southeast Asia. And particularly notable among her digital humanities projects, and I think we're going to hear a bit more about that this evening, is the Mapping Philippine Material Culture Project, a global visual inventory of material culture from the Philippines stored in overseas institutions. And again, I feel like the word stored is probably doing a lot of heavy lifting there. She's principal investigator for two AHRC-funded projects on decolonising Southeast Asian sound archives, with a focus on BBC broadcasts in Southeast Asia, and the digital reconstruction of the lost library of San Pablo as a result of the British invasion of the Philippines in 1762, and her edited volume, The 1762 British Invasion of Spanish-Ruled Philippines Beyond Imperial and National Imaginaries, was published last year by the National Historical Commission of the Philippines. Dr. Juan is therefore the ideal speaker to open this Frank Davis Memorial Lecture Series, which seeks out new ways of thinking through both art history and the digital and those spaces in which they come together with friction and with possibility. I invite you to join me in welcoming her to the portal.
Thank you for the invitation. Invitation to reflect on how the digital age and the rise of digital humanities and digital art history have shifted the ways we think about heritage, material culture, and knowledge production in, I guess, keeping institutions, to put it politely. So before I begin, though, I want to situate myself. I speak today not only as an academic, but as someone who approaches this work of digital humanities with a kind of activist sensibility, grounded in commitments to social justice, source community authority, and the ethical responsibilities we have when we work with cultural heritage displaced by colonialism. So in a sense, this is a kind of very specific kind of, I guess, branch of art history, like post-colonial art history. So for me, using digital technology is inseparable from reparative practice. It is not simply a research method. It is a way of redistributing authority, returning interpretive power to source communities, and ensuring that scholarship produces material benefits for the cultures whose histories were extracted, fragmented, and marginalized. So again, true decolonization in the end cannot end with critique. It must lead to action, and in some ways these projects are going towards that. So I guess this matters a lot especially for Southeast Asia, I guess Southeast Asian art history, basically because of its post-colonial context, where we know, except for Thailand, the whole study of art has been, the whole part of Southeast Asia has been colonized. You can see the different slides there, British possession, French possession, etc. So in a way, the context is already very much different, for, let's say, post-colonial museum and art history studies in a post-colonial context. Aside from this kind of obvious kind of trajectory for post-colonial art, we also know that technologies of our times has always shaped how we look at art history, how we produce art history. So I guess before this would be catalog cards, camera slide protectors, but today we have something categorically different. Digital archives, linked open data, experimental video annotation tools, we have social media, 3D and generative AI. So all these are powerful tools that can either, at least for me, exacerbate or help provide a way to confront and repair post-colonial harms. So how can digital infrastructures enable us to address long-standing post-colonial problems with the study of material cultures? So just looking at kind of what does colonization do, and how is digital humanities supposed to respond to it in a way that is that leans towards social justice. So in the case of the Philippines and its many layers of colonization, 350 years under Spain, briefly British for 2 years, and then 2 years, several years under America, even the Japanese, America, Hollywood / I guess. Colonial collecting has created sort of 4 key structural harms that I seek to address in our digital humanities project. So a lot of it is, one of it is of course the dispersal, fragmentation, and loss of cultural memory, where we know that almost 90% statistically of pre-1950s objects from the Philippines are not in the Philippines. They're in institutions outside of the Philippines. And this is borne out by statistics. No? And I think it's across the board in Southeast Asia, these statistics can also hold true, not only in Southeast Asia, but in Africa, etc., where a lot of these post-colonial nations do have most or majority of their material culture kept in institutions outside. So a lot of these have come through various ways: missionary collecting, salvage anthropology, punitive expeditions, cash economy extraction, colonial curiosity, and even the art market. But we know that entire complexes, cultural complexes, ritual textiles, musical instruments, watercolor portraits, manuscripts are removed and absorbed in museums or institutions. And in the case of the Philippines, are rarely displayed, are much less accessible to people who either made them or who it is about. So this dispersal has produced fragmented histories narrated from the perspective of the colonizer. When you look at object descriptions, and you'll see that later on. Again, the loss of cultural memory, as source cultures have no access to their own material heritage. There's objectification to humanization. Now, once accession, the objects are transformed from a relational, living cultural node into a unit of storage, processed, numbered, decontextualized, amputated from meaning, and folded into the circulation of museum systems. And this, again, results in dehumanization, where we turn the cultural expressions of the colonized people into specimens or mute specimens, and with the makers of them rarely named, for example, or and many times in the case of the Philippines, at least in the UK, rarely studied, much less displayed. Additionally, colonial institutions have imposed Eurocentric frameworks for determining what counts as art or folk art. In the Philippines, in the context of within the context of Southeast Asian art, it's often less studied, I guess, or less valued, mainly because it does not fit the Hindu-Buddhist canon of Southeast Asian art, and it's seen as an outlier. And this, of course, leads to why a lot of Philippine material, even if there is so much in the UK, are ignored or neglected. and most of the times what gets to be displayed or how it is displayed kind of falls by the wayside. And lastly, I guess this extractive knowledge production that has been in some way as a way to address these problems have also kind of contributed to the harm of colonial, I guess post-colonial material culture. So I guess looking at all these sort of colonial harms, you might say, it has to be said that digital humanities, if uncritically applied, can easily recoup them. But I guess with a bit of hope and a very conscious kind of putting your foot down in a way, if it is consciously designed, I do believe that digital infrastructures can help undo them. So, and that's basically kind of what we have been doing at SOAS under the Philippine Studies program. We have put together a lot of different digital approaches to how to address these colonial harms. No? So we deal with all sorts of material or objects of knowledge, you might say, or objects of culture that are kept in institutions outside of the Philippines. So we look at sound archives, we look at looted manuscripts, and all sorts of other things. And tonight, because we set the protocol, I guess, I am going to deal with one of these projects, and which is the Mapping Philippine Material Culture Project as a point of reference. So as has been described, we know that it is a global visual inventory of all of what we can find or have been permitted or accessible to aggregate into an inventory of material culture. So why a digital mapping project? I guess these are kind of very basic, but the first was really at the very basic level. We're looking at a mapping project as a navigational tool to gather baseline data, to know what is out there and where. So how do we even, for example, begin the process of any kind of reconnection or any kind of return if one does not know what is out there? And this is really very true. From 2021, I've been kind of knocking on doors on all sorts of museums, asking, do you have anything from the Philippines? You go to Liverpool Museum, for example, and for a long time they had boxes and boxes of Philippine material culture from 1904 that were basically not cataloged until we kind of knocked on the door and said, oh, do you have anything? And then they began the process of doing something about it. So now with this baseline kind of data comes, of course, other kind of approaches that you can use with aggregated data. And later we'll talk about the power to annotate and the power later to reconnect. But as I was saying, for the most part, the mapping project is kind of investigative in a way, looking for what is out there and where. So just a few examples since the launching of the project in 2021, we've had several examples of really course-changing material evidence of previously unknown aspects of Philippine history, art, and culture that would have kind of, would have just been absent from kind of the understanding of all of this, without these sort of material evidences. So this is just of all places, a bamboo canister that was donated or gifted by a Jesuit priest to the Civic Medieval Museum in Bologna. So yeah, I saw this bamboo tube in a civic museum in Italy, and did not know why it was there. And then of course you do research, etc. and it turns out it's a very rare depiction of a local artist from the 1700s who um, who does a lot of the maps. If you're familiar with the Murillo Velarde map, with Bagay and Suarez, and here he etches on the bamboo canister. So this is a version of 3D art in a sense from a local artist, which I have not met at all. So of course we kind of do different things with it, and we 3D printed, we 3D scanned it so we could go over and see it, but we'll talk about that a little later. But other things that have sort of kind of resulted from all these kind of investigative work in some way are something like this, for example, in Escudo de Armas, which was, again, a very stark reminder of something in history that is actually not very well known or understood, which was the British occupation of Manila and Cavite in 1762. So a lot of people think that the British were never in the Philippines, but they were for 2 years. And this became kind of a real catalyst for thinking about the connections between Madras. So we found this in Madras, a museum in Chennai now, but formerly Madras. And it is taken from the walled city of Manila in Intramuros in 1762 when the British came as a trophy or a war trophy. Then it was brought to Madras and then installed there and stayed there until there were rumors about an Escudo de Armas until we eventually went there to find it and get the data for it. The last kind of example is really something close to my heart because this was just last month at the V&A. There were these wonderful watercolors in a genre called Tipos del País. And this was really a rare distinction of, because there are very many of these Tipos del País, but then this was one of the earliest that came into the V&A collection and in 1840. And it was not cataloged until last month when because it was in a box of random watercolors from all over the world. And then eventually they digitized it and we came to study it. And this is really interesting as well because it has Tagalog verses underneath the watercolor, which really was, and the verses are very funny, they're very ironic and satirical. And this really, again, completely goes against the idea of what was traditionally been thought of as sentimental poetry as a sign of urbanity in the 19th century in Manila. So again, I'm just kind of imagining how much is lost because of these material evidences that are basically absent from the discourse. So having all these digital assets aggregated in one platform has allowed us to use digital tools on them. And there's a lot now that are going around. So we are constantly adding to the platform, changing what is not working, and looking at best practices from similar platforms that allow different levels of access, indigenous data sovereignty, creating media-rich environments, going beyond like textual narratives and object stories. So the mapping project actually uses Omeka, which is an open source platform, which is free to use. And I often have workshops at SOAS to teach students to do community archiving because it's a very intuitive platform, and they have a sandbox, and you can create these little archives of your own material cultures. But I guess we honed into this platform, especially because it allows us to change, to edit. The editing tool is the key thing here. It allows us to change metadata hierarchies, for example. It allows us to add levels of users access, and then users to collaborate. So it's open source and it's easy to work with. Omeka also, because all the data that we've collected is aggregated in one platform, it gives us relational visibility and cross-collection comparison. And that, I guess, is the power of aggregation, which allows for computer vision, which I guess technically it's a type of AI that looks that uses artificial intelligence to enable machine learning to interpret images and let it learn to recognize shapes, colors, brushworks, weaving structures, etc. And uh, and trained on the aggregated data set in the mapping project. So once trained, the system can cluster visually similar objects across different institutions, identify repeated motifs that point to shared practices, etc. So this is another example of a watercolor that for many years we thought did not have an actual, we thought it was just a kind of fancy of Damian Domingo, but we did find through again investigative work, but also through relational kind of algorithm, that there were several pieces in Leiden, and there one in France, and then one that's coming up in the Quai Branly as well. So then you begin to aggregate this and see this kind of motifs, and eventually we saw that, you know, there were many things that we misunderstood about the watercolor and kind of the construction of this, just on the basis of these relational. We've also, we do a lot of other tools to annotate like a visual plane. Like this one is a painting, again, of the British invasion. We use IIIF universal viewers to annotate a visual plane. And there are many tools now that can help a lot, where you can zoom in very, very deeply into a spot and then put text on it. So that has been very helpful as well. And I guess very importantly, and usually it, and I think this is very key, is that it allows the Omeka platform, after the aggregation, we mirror the data first from the institution, but then because we can edit, we correct and enrich the data. And so we do a lot of workshops on writing the Philippine object. So we do, for example, we work with like Marian Pastoroses, to look for, let's say, derogatory terms that have baggage in them. Like tribe is very commonly used in the Philippines because of the Americans who wanted to kind of correlate them with Native Americans, but then it's not very applicable to the Philippines, and it has all these racialized hierarchies, no? Where you have the Indio, then of course the Igorot, the Moro, and the Negrito. So all these you are able to look for, and correct. We also look very much at kind of very generalized, hyper-generalized terms. Sometimes in the object description, they're just said Philippines, and that's it. So again, it becomes a kind of a very objectified, like, oh, that's just from the Philippines, but not knowing, of course, that there's 178 Austronesian languages in the Philippines, and most of the work of provenance, of looking at these material cultures is finding out at a granular level where they are from, and describing them properly, and locating or pinpointing not just Igorot, which is such a pan-regional designation, but actually to go beyond that and look at what village or etc. In a way to, I guess, to humanize, or to this category of these hyper-generalized terms. So just a few examples. I just came back from Cleveland. This is kind of a general, kind of typical way of how things are put in they call the tombstone metadata, where you have all kind of the basic stuff. So you have Moro cloth, and then it's from the Philippines, so hyper-generalized, etc. And then, of course, it says it's plain weave, and then dyed, and nothing else. So I was very lucky that CMA actually invited us to go and look at these. They had 53 Philippine objects, and so we looked very carefully over the week to see, and did the research, and then we found out a lot of very interesting things. So the first thing we do is always try to look at the instead of a moral cloth, it's now we've seen from relational, just looking at the aggregated data, it's a Mandayan textile. So, and this is very important to us in a way to designate the indigenous term, because then if this database or knowledge base is for the source culture, then that's the only way they can find it, right? So we need to put the term, and then it was very interesting to find out a lot of different things as well, like it was a composite of cotton and ikat on abaca. So, and of course the Cleveland Museum wouldn't have known the significance of that, but then if you connect it to the source cultures, they know, oh, this is really interesting. This was in the 1900s. They only do ikat on abaca, and they do not ikat on cotton. But this here, what they do is they fused it, and that's kind of the first time I've seen such a practice, a very ingenious practice, which kind of adapts to people, designers from Manila wanting ikat on cotton. So here they still retain the ikat on the abaca panel, which is the one with the motif, but then the rest of the other parts are cotton. So yeah, it was just really interesting, and we would never have known that until we digitized it, and they helped us also to look at very kind of chemical, kind of more microscopic analysis of the text. So other things that we do to kind of humanize or to I guess create this sense of approaching to repair these colonial harms is putting together archival material in like accession records, and then looking for whatever way we can make the maker visible, or make the village, for example, as granular as possible. So, and there are instances at the AMNH, for example, the American Museum of Natural History, there are huge archival material that is separate from the art or from the material culture. And one of the ways that the platform does is to put together the archival material. So in this case, this is from the AMNH. We know the name, she's the mother of Ayang, the maker of this beautiful salugbued, they call. So yeah, those are just kind of the things that are slowly, it's slow work, but it's also really kind of, it makes you feel very different when you're looking at an archive and seeing how all these hands have been making this, instead of all just kind of names and stuff. We also do a lot of provenance research, which we add to the material culture project. So again, this is from the Peabody Museum at Harvard, and that's what it is when you look at the online site. It has, typical, again, tombstone metadata, etc., brass, etc. But then, again, with the archival material that we were able to kind of dig up, we begin to see provenance. And I guess there's a lot of provenance research that people do now. I mean, a lot of museums are really kind of funding these, but sometimes there's a kind of tendency towards who's collecting, the collecting history, rather than who made it. And in this case, this was really interesting to see that this was captured by a member of the Philippine Constabulary, and the name of the datu is there, etc. And again, it allows us to write out provenance records that are so specific that in some ways it can lend itself to what, to maybe repatriation, or to looking at other ways to connect this material. So again, we aggregate all of that in the mapping site, and so let's kind of, but I guess looking at the colonial harms at a kind of metadata level in terms of, let's say, annotation and stuff, the next kind of part of the project, or the next kind of, it's really the heart of the project, is what are we doing all these things for, annotating, etc., etc. And one of the basic real, I guess, again, the activist bent that I'm talking about is how we go beyond this baseline data, this annotated baseline data, and see the archive really as a site of engagement. And so here we, instead of treating the archives as like a neutral storage or a place where things are preserved, we reconceive them as participatory digital spaces for repair. So where metadata is co-produced with source communities, where a return or a reconnection can be made. So we have tons of different activities or whatever. Some of them are, through the years, some have been done by design, some are by this happenstance. Something comes up and somebody emailed me actually 2 months ago and said, you have a photograph of my grandmother on your website. And this is the name of my grandmother. Can I have a copy of this? And so, of course, we do not include photographs actually, only as archival references in the. So, of course, we put the name of the grandmother, and we sent her a photo of the thing. But anyway, so everything kind of comes together, kind of ad hoc. We do a lot of workshops like this one. The RJM in Cologne, in Germany, had this bamboo tube that they couldn't figure out what it was. So we did a workshop. We had a workshop trying to analyze this thing, of course, and we had source cultures from the Tagbanua. And we set up a Zoom call. We had the elders come down, and then we just kind of talked about it. And yeah, it's interesting. The Filipinos are surprisingly very much online. I think, in fact, they are the biggest users of Facebook in the whole world. So, and I think because Facebook also is free in the Philippines, if you use your data on Facebook, it's free. So yeah, that we are able to do all these sorts of online workshops. We do even social media. Facebook is a big thing in the Philippines. So this one was really something that Marianne posted. This is at the British Museum. There were inscriptions in the back, and no one would understand. And so yeah, it was just a really kind of free-flowing, collaborative transcription. Huh? And some were like, oh, that's not right. And the other one was like, oh, no, this is exact. But anyway, what was interesting looking at the process was really kind of just a sense of ownership of their heritage as they went along, kind of discussing it, and just having that space where there was discussion was, I think, even kind of the most important part of it, rather than actually knowing what it was. So we also support a lot of 3D imaging. We had a conference on digital repatriation this year. We have our annual Philippine Studies Conference. And so Timothy, a young architect from the Philippines, one day just emailed me and said, I'm doing something called guerrilla photogrammetry. I'm in the Field Museum and I have my camera. And do you think it's okay if I'm gonna just take a whole bunch of pictures around the Golden Tara? The Golden Tara is very iconic figure in kind of Philippine, because it's one of the few pieces that have kind of a Hindu-Buddhist influence. It was retrieved from a river, and it has all these mythical things. But then it was sold, it was sold, I guess illegally, to the Field Museum in the 60s, I think. But anyway, so he just went there and then did this. And what was really interesting and what I liked about what he did was he not only did that, but then he used the 3D rendering to print some and to bring it to Agusan, where it comes from. And he was saying for the first time they were able to see kind of the back, because usually in photographs it's always just the front that they see. So they were able, and the best part I think was that he uploaded the 3D rendering online as open source, so anyone now can download. And he said that a lot of them have been using it as a mold to create brass models from the rendering. You know? So yeah, it was interesting. We also do things like photo elicitation. This is an anthropological method that is often used. So we did those as well with permission. Oh, by the way, the Field Museum did give me, I asked Jamie Kelly, I was just telling you about Jamie Kelly, a really good curator, and that's kind of how we do a lot of our work as well when collection managers really are open to working with community source communities. So I told him about Timothy's 3D guerrilla photogrammetry, and he said, no, it's fine. But I don't think you can do that in the British Museum. Oops. Anyway, we do photo elicitation. It's an anthropological, methodology where you have high resolution photos of material culture and bring them to the elders. And then we have what they call here in the case of Blaan in Mindanao, we just have a conversation, a lot of food, just talking about these material cultures, how they feel about it, and if there's anything that they want to correct, and different things. There's and that was interesting when we were showing, for example, the mats that were kept at the Field Museum again from 1904 when Fakou Percol brought these to the Field Museum. They were not interested when they're saying, we don't really want those back, but how did they do the patterns? How did they do the dyes, etc.? So in a way, it became kind of a way to see what do they want from these sort of, I guess, photos. You know, did they want it returned, or did they want to learn from it? So, but one really kind of heart-wrenching thing that happened as well during that Blaan Kastulan was there's in the Field Museum, they have the attribution as bilaan, which is something that to them is really derogatory. And so the elder was saying, oh, we really hate it when people say it because they do not have a vowel after B. So they just say blaan. And I couldn't really understand what that meant. Like it seemed kind of trivial in a way, but it was so it was really something that was very important to them. So again, with digital tools, and with the help of some software developer, we were able to globally change Blaan, all the instances of Blaan in the mapping site into how they want it spelled. So if you go to the mapping site now, everything is spelled. And it was done on real time. So that was really powerful when they saw that they had the power to inscribe themselves into the record. So that was really, and it was very nice that if you go to the Field Museum now, they have changed it as well to reflect this. So we had a lot of conversation about what happened, and so the Field Museum changed it as well. But you don't see that in others. Anyway, so these are just a few other stuff that we have that we try to do with media-rich environments to create stuff. And then just to conclude, I guess, just once in a while, even all this digital repatriation that we call sometimes can result in actual repatriation. So this is Billy Riley, who's from Derbyshire. She's a British woman. She was in Bali in the 60s, 70s, and she heard about the mapping project and that we were bringing photographs to the Tiboli to show them this is a blanket called a yekumo. And so when she heard about it, she said, I actually have a lot of Tiboli material culture. And she said, can you bring it and return it to them? So it was a personal collection, but it was beautiful, like really. Anyway, what happened was eventually we said, why don't you just come with us and then you return it. So when she went, of course, she knew everyone. People recognized her and stuff like that. But then again, it became kind of a catalyst. And then as time went on, there were other people who started giving back from the Tiboli themselves, giving back to this man that we found, Benji Manuel, who has become like the caretaker for Billy's collection, and also kind of encourage other Tiboli women to again replicate, but based on the old exemplars that were brought back. And then like the dyes, etc. They're really very into the natural dyes that are used, because now we do a lot of tourist kind of, I guess, for the market, for when they're making the blankets. And then, we had a film that we created from that, and you're welcome to watch it if you're interested, and you can email me for the link. I should have put it there, but yeah. So in some sense, this has become kind of the crux of the mapping project when we begin to reconnect material culture, and of course, a lot of it starts with a lot of research, annotation, looking for indigenous terms and granularity of provenance and all these things before we can even try to find kind of the source cultures, the original creators. But with digital tools and all this stuff, there is, in a sense, there can be ways to do it. So let me just conclude, I guess, with the question of how digital infrastructures can change art historical thought. And digital humanities, I guess, reshapes art history by, in some sense, producing new categories of evidence, which are relational, embodied, and participatory. It can challenge colonial taxonomies, redistribute interpretive authority with our platform. We are able to inscribe kind of the thoughts of the source cultures. And then you center, I guess, indigenous epistemologies in the platform. And then, and I guess going back to the kind of activist dimension in this work, digital humanities, as I was saying, can reproduce colonial power, or it can disrupt it. If communities take control of the tools, define the metadata, shape the structures, and author the narratives, then digital infrastructures can become mechanisms for repair, for restoration, for visibility. And I guess digital reconstruction is not restitution in some way, but it is a reparative infrastructure in some sense. It's a way to rebuild a kind of the symbolic worlds broken by colonialism, recentering indigenous authority, and create futures in which source communities determine the meaning, movement, and destiny of their cultural heritage. So, and I guess I end with this quote where it says, and I'm always really inspired by this, that this is what it means to take control of the tools. And I guess you can look at the digital infrastructure as tools. And this is what happens when it can align, digital humanities can align itself with a kind of a decolonizing practice. And I guess the future of what we're working towards at the Mapping Project is a working one, but the archive hopefully more and more will belong to the people whose worlds it contains. Thank you.